Namaste and Happy New Year to all of us. Namaste, Sraddhalu. Namaste, Narad.
Namaste.
Namaste, and I wish a Happy New Year to everyone, filled with love and light and peace and the grace and blessings of Sri Aurobindo and Mother.
We are happy to continue today part 15 on the current affairs, and today we will go into the war machine, studying what's going on in Ukraine. So let us start. Thank you.
Yes, we'll jump straight into the topic. For those who might be seeing this for the first time, please do recall that this is part of a series of discussions which have built up a certain perspective. And only with the background that we have built up can you fully appreciate what we will discuss today. In particular, the first few of this series, which discussed the Cabal background and their interest and the satanic influences involved in some of these, which want war, which want humanity destroyed, which want to create conflict, division everywhere among all peoples, all groups, in order to delay or even disrupt evolution, which wants to create a one-world state in which humanity can be oppressed and reduced to a slave mass run by an elite, hacking the human consciousness, manipulating human beings to make them subservient, dependent, less informed, less intelligent, more sick, more unhealthy, so that they're always running to stay on the same spot, to reduce economies to the level of survival, so that you're too busy surviving to think of revolution or to topple the elites. It is on a global scale what you saw in the past in small feudal spaces, but with the benefit of the advanced technologies of communications today and artificial intelligence and other means. That being one part of the background. The other part of the background is what we discussed the last few times. The 100-year war, where a state plans ahead, 100 years ahead if needed, to overthrow another. And the way an overthrow can be engineered, the preparation for the engineering going back several decades, sometimes going back several generations, because the interests are of that kind. We as ordinary, I will use the word educated in quotation marks, in the conventionally educated, are taught to think in terms of next few days or next few weeks, at most the next few months, not even next 1 year. To think in terms of short terms, to think in terms of the moment's benefit, the satisfaction of the desire, and so on. The elite families teach their children to think of their family lineage and the domination, control, importance, identities that they have as a collective ego of a lineage or a generation or a group or whatever it is they belong to. And if these are hijacked by certain occult forces, then you have also the inspiration behind which looks ahead many centuries. And it does not much care if it loses, if there are setbacks. It knows it can bide its time, it can wait for a generation to pass, it can wait for an individual to die eventually just from age, if necessary. But mostly they intervene by assassinations and other means. So all this background you have to appreciate, and then when you link that to what we described last time as a toolkit, as a template for overthrowing elections or administrations or political leaderships, and the control of the mass media in which you can be made to dance on demand by just having a few screaming headlines for a few days, and suddenly you have people going on candlelight vigils, waving flags and self-immolating for raising awareness on whatever it is that's the current flavor of the day as an issue. This background we have to have. So with this background we turn to the situation in Ukraine for the last 2 years now almost. It started in February, about 2 years ago, when Russia invaded the eastern part of Ukraine. And I'm choosing my words very carefully, and you'll understand why. Russia did not invade the whole of Ukraine. It was a very clearly stated goal, and it stuck largely to its goal. But then things escalated in other ways. And I will not even say Russia is right or Ukraine is right. In a war, all sides are wrong. Because whatever your disagreement, whatever your differences, whatever your interests, it is possible to resolve them, even if it's difficult, even if it takes long. If there is goodwill, you can find resolution. When there is no goodwill, when there is intention which is different, then you have a war where people have to die or suffer. So, in any war situation, and I say this even of Hamas and its attacks on Israel and Israel's defense, if there is war, both sides are wrong. But, as in the case of Hamas, where one side provokes the war needlessly, that side is more wrong. Whatever its causes, whatever its grievances, whether genuine or otherwise, it can be done without that. So, when you look at Ukraine and Russia, you do not find between them any compulsion to go to war. In fact, Ukraine has been a critical part of what was the erstwhile Soviet Union, in ways that it was even apparent that when Ukraine separated in the Soviet Union, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine both lost. I give an example of what happens in India. When India was partitioned, at that point, let's say Bangladesh, which was at that point East Pakistan, and Bengal, which is actually one big Bengal, which became then East Bengal and West Bengal, based on the British policy of divide and rule. The one side was producing and the other side was consuming goods. Or for other goods, it was the other side producing and this side consuming. In the moment of partition, suddenly there was a cutting between consumer and producer from both directions. Both sides, the economies collapsed with other consequences. So something similar happened when Ukraine and Russia separated from their Soviet Union framework, and naturally there was a scramble to also re-engage in various ways. And we have to also recognize each of these East European countries, which were part of the Soviet Union, each had its own distinctive identities. Generally, when we find someone has a distinctive linguistic character, distinct language and script, even if it is shared, they're derived from the same, you can say there is a regional identity. Even if it's regional, it may not be national always, but there's a regional identity. And so there are these identities, and these identities have their differences and sometimes painful, but if there is the general underlying goodwill, these are resolved. I have put on today's discussion in the references several links, in all about 8 links, which I would like you to see later, not now. And for those of you who have seen the links last time, you will also have the background necessary for today. But in one of those links, there is the information about how Lenin, the title of the article is Lenin's Bolsheviks placed Russia's new regions on a collision course with Ukraine 100 years ago. If you really want to understand the differences between Russians and Ukrainians, you have to go 100 years back. But I would still ask this question. If for 100 years you didn't need to go to war, was there a need to go to war now? And my answer simply would be no. So there were other interests which compelled the war. And those interests are the cause, not Russia, not Ukraine. And we will see what those interests are. There is another article there which is also called The Seeds of the Split, how Russians speaking Donbass first attempted to win independence from Ukraine in 2004. Again, these are useful to understand how these differences built up and became cause for a war. But even these are not the real reasons for the war. The real reasons are actually outside the domain of what is currently being discussed in the media entirely. And I'm going to touch upon some of these. I won't say it is all, but at least it will give us a broader picture and a broader background. In the same way as we had looked at the Israel-Hamas war, and it's not Israel-Palestine war, it's Israel-Hamas war, you looked at various other influences which were involved, including arms trade, including financial, let's say, kickbacks, and including oil and gas, and so on. So in the same way, we see here in the Ukraine war several angles, and I will touch upon several of them. None of them in themselves needed a war. Even all of them combined did not need a war. But then there were certain triggers which we will look at, which go back to certain larger cabal agendas. So first of all, we recognize that there is this cabal which wants the world to be at war. If they could, they would just allow or trigger everywhere all kinds of conflicts and reduce the world to a chaos, which you will see is the theme for many of the recent movies, particularly going back the last 8 or 10 years, and even television series about worldwide collapse into chaos, breakdown of the internet, some kind of asteroid coming to destroy the earth, or there's some very weird, unusual TV series which are powerfully promoted. And when they are promoted, although they are not interesting, although they are weird, you must understand there's an agenda. And one of these is of a group of children which suddenly one day overnight finds itself just there as children. All the adults have vanished or they've died for some unknown cause. And then they have to survive alone. And what happens becomes the theme of the series. Now, why would you even imagine such a crazy scenario and then hammer it away in the promotion? Or another, which is recent science fiction, is a group of youngsters which come on a new planet, and again they are all teenagers or just young adults, and there are no other adults, and they have to survive. Why would you do that? And it's part of the, so to say, it's called predictive programming, where you are made to get used to certain scenarios and ideas, so that when things go in that direction, you just accept it and say, yes, of course, it's inevitable. I know what it is. You don't question, you're not surprised, and you docilely accept that flow of events because you were prepared for it and even made to expect it. And you'll see one of the links which I have also shared up here. It is the link number 8. It's called Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to the next world war. Civilization may not survive. Stated by George Soros on the World Economic Forum. Now, why would a regional conflict, and this is purely over some very trivial issues, why could that lead to the next world war? Why is this man who is actually funding so many things across the world, including wars, speaking about a third world war for what is very obviously a regional conflict? Because that's part of the predictive programming. So I'm putting some of these links. It will be helpful for you to see them, but later. Right now, let's focus on the big picture here. So yes, there's a cabal which wants it, but then there are other interests, and among them particularly, which right now are the ones primarily sustaining the war in Ukraine, are the arms manufacturers who have multiple interests. First of all, they sell. When they manufacture whatever equipment, let's say particularly rockets, missiles, bombs, there is a certain sell by or use by age. So let's say you've created a missile. It has chemicals which are used to power the missile when it flies. Those chemicals have a shelf life, after which they become unreliable. The electronics has a shelf life, after which you're not too sure whether it will still work, because eventually things rust. Even electronics, with all the best you can do with the military electronics to harden them, eventually they do break down. And you don't want to reach a situation where you've invested so much money in building this expensive missile, and then you just have to throw it away because you want to sell it. So once you've sold it to somebody, those who have bought it again are sitting on it. And after a while there is a use by date. So there's a sell by date and then there's a use by date. After a certain date you can't sell because those people won't buy, because they need at least for the missile to survive 10 or 20 years. So once you have it sitting in your military, you have a use by date, And if you don't use it, eventually that investment just goes to waste. So these are compulsions of the nature of the arms manufacturing lobbies as well as militaries. With that comes another angle. This is the sales angle. There is a new angle which in this case is fascinating for everybody. And it's one of the reasons why every country with any meaningful military does not want the wars to end. This particular Ukraine war, they don't want it to end. Because it has become now a test bed for new technologies. You see, what has happened since the last war was fought, which as a real war, it's been a few decades. The only so-called wars that we are told about going back even 30 years is the US invading Iraq, Afghanistan, or some little country in Africa, or as they topple a few governments without necessarily firing any missiles. The last bombing they did in Kosovo or other places, all these were one-sided. Even taking over Panama, one-sided. It's such a powerful military. What did the US do when they entered Iraq, invaded Iraq? What did they do? They shot a very large number of missiles, blew out practically all of the control centers, underground bunkers, missile stockpiles, and wherever the military was dug in, they blew them out, used other kinds of technologies also to create psychological fear and so on. And literally overnight, everybody came out of their bunkers and surrendered. What could they do? Pretty much nothing. Look at Afghanistan, bombing against guerrillas who lived in caves practically. Yes, they had a few missiles, they shot down a few US planes, but there's nothing really significant in terms of a war. The last real great war that you can think of perhaps is a little bit in what happened in Vietnam, because again Vietnam was a proxy war. From the other side you had the weapons and funds coming from a larger communist countries, and so you had something happening which seemed more like a war, but other than that you have not seen real wars. And so since then technologies have improved so much. Not just missiles, not just explosives, not just precision of the guidance. All these can be tested. You don't need a war for that. What you need to test is the strategic patterns of war. So let's say, for example, China and India, because China has so many times made these incursions, claimed lands which were India's, and constantly is following the policy of what they call death by 1,000 cuts. They will keep making little punches, little holes, bleeding you dry economically, financially, politically, militarily, and of course morally. Drop your morale. Oh, it'll keep happening. We're tired of it. We just want it to end. And then, so this keeps happening. But for the other side, wherever India has had to, in response to China's building of roadways, dams on the edge of India, India has had to build its own roadways. But what happens if tomorrow it breaks out? China has some of the pretty advanced weapons, missiles, planes, and now most recently drones. India has had to play a catch-up on the drone technology, some of it buying from others, some of it developing in-house. So the cycle of developing a weapon in-house typically is 7 to 8 years. Interestingly, the cycle for purchase of a weapon, going through all the testing, basically you invite all the bids, go through various kinds of, you have your specifications of what you need, you go through various kinds of testing and so on, and going through that until finally you come to the last, the expenses, negotiations, after which you place an order, after which it takes 2 years to actually manufacture and by putting it in a pipeline. Because the nature of many of these arms, especially where you have to go in large numbers, is you cannot manufacture small numbers. You have to have an entire pipeline. And the pipeline for manufacture, once you begin, takes about 2 years because you have to bring in all the resources, connect them, and you can't stop it until about 1 or 2 years are over. Now, all of this is also significant for Ukraine, as we will see, but I'm giving you the background. So the total cycle from the point you say, I have a need, to the point you get delivery, is again typically 7 years, let's say. 6, 7, 8, depending on the kinds of weapons. So you make it yourself, designing from scratch, you buy from someone else. It's almost the same. Except that those people already have the technology, whereas you need to develop it. That may give you an extra addition of either lack of or need for competence, or additional investment because you need to actually do the research and test at each level. For example, if you have a missile guidance unit, they may already have a guidance unit which they share across 20 different missiles with some variations, whereas you might end up developing from scratch and testing it, and you must have the capabilities for the engineering, the minds, and as well as the technologies for manufacture. So, which a small country, let's say like Sri Lanka, cannot do, Pakistan cannot do, Bangladesh absolutely down in the dumps technologically, but India can. So India is an exception where actually the cost of purchase and time of purchase is almost the same as developing it yourself. So why didn't they do that before? Just because politicians in the past were more interested in kickbacks. For all military purchases, 30% at least would be a commission which would come back to the politicians. Sometimes in the name of the party, some portion would be shared, but mostly coming back to the individuals right at the top of the food chain of the political party. It's only after Modi came to power that he is one person who says, I don't need money, and I will ensure none of the people around me can take money, which is why he was not liked by his own party at some point. But those who aligned with his values became now the core team. But as a result, they've been able to purchase the same equipment for much less, but you needed to purchase in cases where you already had prior commitments or prior ties and you could get it within a few years. What had happened over the years was India had actually lost so much in terms of capability in technologies because of purchase of unnecessary, useless and outdated equipment, just because it was convenient for kickbacks, that the military was on the brink of collapse in terms of equipment and training and otherwise. So there was a need to quickly buy. Subsequently, though, what you found, Modi's government was pushing for indigenous production. And it's now 8 years about, and we can actually see the benefits of this today. Compare this with Ukraine, which cannot do much of this. Interestingly, though, when Ukraine and Russia were joined together under USSR, a lot of advanced equipment, including missiles and airplanes, were shared across. So often it happened that design centers were in Russia, while the manufacture centers were in Ukraine, or sometimes Ukraine had certain capabilities and Russia would have the manufacturing, and so on. So this was one of the great losses with the separation that came, but with it also came something very important. I'm actually drifting, but I'll come back to the point that Ukraine had a background of certain advanced technologies, but didn't have sufficient stock. Most of their equipment, including their fighters, were Russian when the war started. All of their elite military was trained with Russian military. So imagine on one side the generals on Russian side and the generals on Ukraine are literally like brothers in arms. They trained under the same school as friends, and now we're going to war against each other. You have to understand this because this is a part of the big problem that happened during the Ukraine war. Literally, each side knows the other as friends, knows how the other thinks, is used to the same equipment, has in fact the same equipment, and you're going to war for what? So there's a very strong resistance on both sides to want to go to war. But now comes the arms manufacturers, and I was speaking about why for them it is important, this war. By ratcheting up the war to a scale which is really high, really intense, where it becomes a question of survival, and not just USA invading Iraq or Afghanistan and blowing up everything in the way. It forces each side now to expose its most advanced technology and to test it. And most important, what I said, it's not the missiles which you can test independently, it's the strategic moves. So again, coming back to China and India, if China invades, it's not on the mountains, you're not going to send tanks first. Of course, they've also made the roads for that. It will be air power. And it will not just be the planes, it will be drones. Because today's drones are so advanced, so sophisticated, so complex. Plus, You have very advanced radars. Plus, you have stealth planes, stealth missiles. Plus, something which Russia has for the first time exposed and in the world, actually used in warfare, is the Mach 5 or Mach 10 missiles, hypersonic missiles, which India did not have, Russia had, US has, China also has. US claimed it was behind Russia in technology and has accelerated its program after Russia used it. But how do these work? Will our advanced radars be able to detect the hypersonic missiles? And if they can detect, will you have enough time to counter it? Can you use AI to be able to detect a hypersonic missile well before you have conventional radars picking it up? These are all questions which are critical to war, based on which long-term war strategies would be built up. And it is in the interests of all these warmongers, that's why I call it the war machine is here, it's in their interest to actually test it out on a real life scenario. And if there is to be a place where this scenario is tested out, which would be the best place for the maximum benefit? And we will see why Ukraine becomes the best place for this. And so it's not about Ukraine, it's not about Russians. It's about this compulsive need to have a real battle where you can test out your equipment and the other needs of the cabal just to create difficulties of all kinds. So testing of new technology has become one of the key elements for the arms manufacturers as well as militaries of the world, and that is being done today in Ukraine. Based on what's happened in Ukraine in just 2 years, every country has changed its overall thinking and strategy. One of the best sources for those of you who are interested in this angle of analysis and understanding, one of the best sources I have found is the Eurasian Times. I'll try to add that as a link later. It's one where you have largely people from the Indian military writing articles, doing analysis of the world global situation. And there's a lot of analysis of what's really happening in Ukraine on a military level and from a strategic perspective. For those to whom it interests, you'll find good articles there. That being the case, there are also hidden, secret, advanced technologies. So I already mentioned stealth technologies. You have stealth bombers, stealth fighters, stealth missiles, and then there is something which was called energy weapons. I'm particularly responding to Anupam's question where he says, please shed some light about direct energy weapons in the chat box. So this is one of the tools which, although existing, although actively used, is kept secret, and you will not find anything coming up in the mainstream media, because it's almost there's a control in the mainstream media that we don't want people to start thinking in terms of energy weapons. Now these energy weapons are of, let's say, 3 kinds. One will be where they are based on a drone. A drone comes and it has enough, let's say, power, sometimes it's chemical power, it's a battery which can last a few seconds, consuming itself, to send a strong energy beam pulse. Now this can be a laser which heats, burns, sets fire to something from a distance, or it can be electromagnetic pulse which knocks out all the electronics in a certain range around it by creating a sharp electric spike. So let's say you have a mobile phone. If there's a strong electromagnetic field which passes as a wave, it will induce in the tiny wires inside, including inside the chips, it will induce a current. So if you can create a spike which is strong enough, it will create a current which is strong enough that it will blow the chips, the circuitry, and render it useless. That's called an EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapon. And sometimes these have semi-nuclear basis, sometimes they are purely by other means. But there is also electromagnetic beam radiation, which is one of the most unusual because you cannot see it. And this has become a very advanced technology operating on multiple levels. So it can beam an electromagnetic field as a beam, microwaves typically, which can hit the missile and cause it to either heat up or cause electromagnetic pulses which burn out its electronics. Or the same on a slightly lower level of intensity can be beamed at a crowd or an individual. And depending on the pulsations of the electromagnetic microwaves and fields, it can create in your body heat, suddenly you'll feel your skin is becoming intensely hot, where outside there's nothing hot. Or, depending again on the frequencies and the pulsations, it will penetrate the skin and trigger electricity inside your nervous system, which effectively makes your body experience intense pain everywhere simultaneously. These are technologies which you will find described, evidence for it exists in some, typically in these science programs where they'll say, oh, cutting edge of science. And what I'm describing is 20 years old. You have demonstrations of these, videos of demonstrations of this on crowd control. So, for example, you beam it on a crowd and whatever 100 or 1,000 people, it doesn't matter. You can widen the beam or narrow it to a single individual, and the person will feel either intense heat or intense pain as long as they're in the beam, and they will just run away. The nature of the reaction on you is so strong you cannot survive it. You widen the beam, you can hit a crowd of 100 or 1,000. And this could be done by a drone, because it can act at a distance of several hundred meters. Now, these are all technologies which exist. They are not so new, it's just they have not been deployed or used in any public way. So when I mentioned the Iraq war, I said they used other technologies to make people run out of their bunkers. They used technologies of this kind, which effectively inside the bunker produced in them a state of panic and fear, literally terror. And they cannot control themselves, they have to run out somehow and come into the open. And as long as the beam is on, you just experience this terror. There are other technologies which maybe I'm digressing, but they've been developed, and this is all going back 20, 30 years. They were trying to understand how smells affect the mind. Remember, it all starts from mind as a product of brain idea. So your nose and the sensory parts of your nose are the closest to your brain. Even your taste has a longer link and more indirect. Nose, if you apply, let's say, a drop of some liquid in the nose, it's absorbed and directly through the nerves, a few centimeters in, hits your brain. Through the tissue, it hits your brain. If you poke a stick through the nose long enough, it hits your brain. That's how close the smell and this opening to the brain is. In the Egyptian mummification, they would take out brain through the nose. So this being so close, so intense, and the nose has literally several thousand kinds of sensors, much more rich than the taste buds. And they activate the brain at its center. So if this control center of the brain is in the center where the nose links. So if you can, through the nose, influence the brain, it can have the maximum impact. So one of the technologies that they were exploring, this is going back in the 1980s in the USA. They were exploring the technology for smells which would create fear or other moods. So just as pheromones can affect your psychology, make you disoriented or turn your thoughts in certain directions, and you don't even know it because you don't smell it consciously, are there pheromones or smells which will create terror, dread, or make you lose hope and just give up? And yes, these things also were created. Since I don't have more data on what the created form of it was, I won't speak more. But the electromagnetic beam was considered to be far more practical because at a distance of several hundred meters, you could have the same effect. So the smells, only a limited use. Beams, far more powerful. Including, by oscillating those beams in particular ways, you can create what is called an interference pattern of a lower frequency. So let's say the beam is of several gigahertz. By tweaking it and operating two beams, you can create a combination of beat, which is of an audio frequency, and literally feed a sound inside your brain. So when that beam is put on you and it's modulated in this way, you will hear in your brain a voice inside your head, a voice which you can hear clearly, distinctly, and you can make it say anything. And this is how they also controlled people and created all kinds of cults by saying, oh, this is voice of God speaking to you, or whatever else. And all these technologies are pretty old now, but they've never been tested or at least openly discussed in their testing. So this is one side of technology, but when it comes to this, what he has asked, Anupam has asked, directed energy weapons, that is so much more powerful. Literally from a distance, from a drone, you can beam a car and melt the metal. Beam at a house. the metal inside starts melting. The wood does not catch fire except by the melting metal. And unfortunately, we find in many places where the fires have taken place, we find these very clear, distinct signs which suggest that such weapons have been used to artificially create fires in various parts of the world for whatever objectives. And one of the signs there is where there is a metal interface, metal rubber for example. The rubber does not melt, but metal melts. You cannot explain that except by an electromagnetic beam which is pulsating and creating electricity and thus heating metal. Rubber doesn't conduct, it doesn't heat up except by the melting metal which then makes the rubber burn. So when you see that sign, you know it's been done intentionally by such beams. So can you use this during a war? Yes, of course. Is it used? Yes, of course. So I said there are three platforms on which this can be done. One is drone, the other is satellite beams, the same thing, but it needs far greater power because of the distance and there's a loss in the atmosphere. And the third, which is on the ground level, where you can use similar things, project through, let's say, from a tank or other means. So these are again part of the equipment never tested in warfare, at least openly. So you would want to test it. But more important is this strategic change because of AI and drones. And if you've been following the nature of the war, you can see how it's been ratcheting up. At some point when the war intensified, okay, I will have to backtrack a bit. Russia declared certain objectives while invading Ukraine, 3 objectives. And they declared the condition under which they would stop the war, which is Ukraine had simply to say that they would not join NATO. And they would end the war immediately, overnight. But 3 objectives, which by the way they completed within the first 2 months. And this is a report which comes from the Finland intelligence agencies that announced that according to their understanding, Russia had demilitarized the Azov regiment, which was a Nazi group, as well as the other objectives, 3 objectives that they had. That completed all 3 objectives in the first 2 months. And subsequently, each time that Ukraine was armed again and again and the war re-triggered and ratcheted up to a higher level, they redid 3 times, they completed their objectives. Each time completing it, the war could have ended. In fact, it started in February. In April, Zelensky had made an overture to end the war. This is all part of public newspaper, you just have to look up the dates. He had offered to end the war, offered to mediate for this by making this declaration they would not join NATO. And that's when the UK Prime Minister went over, demanded for Zelensky to pull back and refuse to cede and increase the war. Now, these are all things on record. I don't need to go further. I'm not looking at the cause of the war. I'm looking first at this, that there were goals, objectives, interests which wanted the war to perpetuate. It could have ended in April, not once, but 3 times over. And Zelensky actually tried that. But as we have seen in the discussion last time, he's a cabal puppet. There's not much he can do on his own. So, the arms manufacturer have this objective. Third objective that they have, and that's one of the more crazy ones, is the kickbacks to themselves or to the politicians who are funding them. Remember, an arms company has its primary client, not you and I, the politicians who control the country, and it goes all the way up. It's not second rung or third rung politicians. It's the people who will decide to spend, let's say, 1, 2, 3% of your GDP to buy expensive arms. That goes all the way to the top. So they talk to the highest levels, or they talk below only to get to the highest levels. And those highest levels, if they're buying for kickbacks, as it used to be in India for decades, then the whole arrangement is through these intermediaries that we will provide you the kickback the way you want. Remember, it can be up to 30% at least. And the intermediary takes their own little pockets and so on. And for that purpose, they need the war in order to be able to feed the kickback. Now, I'll show you how that works. Let's say Ukraine. You're all familiar because you'll see headlines every few weeks that US government is now allocating so many millions for Ukraine, sending so much equipment for Ukraine, or as happened also in Europe, in NATO, a lot of old junk equipment which had passed its life was sent to Ukraine to be used up in the name of helping Ukraine and somehow to extend the war. So Germany sent its tanks. I believe in the first 2 or 3 weeks, most of them broke down because they were so old and not well maintained that Ukraine refused to take the balance of them. It was so stupid if you think about it. But they wanted to get rid of that inventory. It's just taking up space. They know they can't use it. They know they won't go to war against Russia. So why not give it away and use it up and free your space so you can buy more tanks, more shiny, new, advanced technologies. But for the people funding Ukraine, let's say the US politicians now, when they give that money, where does the money go? Ukraine has to buy arms, right? So it goes right back to the US producers of arms. They will not give money to Ukraine to buy arms from other producers. They will give it so it comes back to the US in some form. That's how these, so to say, so-called donations work. But as part of that routing, there will be a commission which will come to them. And if it's gone to Ukraine and then from there it gets routed, there is nobody in the US, no exchequer in the US, no attorney general or whatever the military means of validation is involved to check that the money did not come into a kickback. Because it goes to Ukraine. From Ukraine, what happens is part of Ukraine's data. And Ukraine as a government being at war can easily misplace data. So the routing of funds becomes one of the major things. I would have put many more links because each of these statements I can justify. There's a link, but you'll find all this in the media. There's a link of a high-level ranking officer in Ukraine who was arrested for siphoning of $60 million, one man. Now, obviously, there's no way one man can do it without the active participation of the leadership. But somebody exposed him, something happened, we don't know the full story, eventually he's caught. But this is an example of the amount of money one person technically could misdirect, and consider how many billions the US has sent over. So all of this is part of the interests of the arms manufacturers combined with the career politicians. Career politicians, of course, have the kickback interest. They also have their self-image. A war president is somehow more respectable in the public image. And you have to understand what it represents of the public's view, because it plays on the ego identity of the nation. You feel good, you feel high because your president did this. I am so great because my president. You have to see the ego sense of the group. It's not rational, it's instinctive. So a war president gets re-elected inevitably. So many want to go to war in order to get elected. And we have seen this with many US presidents in the past, I don't need to name. But so there's the career politicians have the image, and the more jingoism they can demonstrate, the more they think they are part of this image building exercise. So there is one particular Lindsay, I think, who actually says right at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, he says that let's blow up Russia, let's use nuclear weapons, let's destroy everything. Some kind of very, I will call insane speeches of this kind, which the jingoism that perhaps he considered would improve his image. There's a third reason why politicians would want a war, which is to stay in power without doing real work. When there's no war, people are asking you, why is my food price high? Why is this not happening? Why is there a lack of this or the other facility? Why are my roads not good? But in the midst of war, everybody puts themselves in a state of acceptance of suffering for the sake of the war. Except here it's not US going to war, at least not overtly. Isn't it? It's a proxy war. US is funding, US is sending equipment, US is sending its military advisors, even its troops on the ground. Even some of their pilots flying the US equipment which they could not train Ukrainians to fly. So it's actually a proxy war. Ukraine is only a front for some other interests, cabal interests, military arms manufacturer, career politician interests. And they're using this occasion for whatever goals. And in this process, the American people are being hyped up. That's the reason, one of the reasons for the hyping, to make you except the need for pumping funds. So at the same time while this was happening in Hawaii, there was a major fire. And as a result, entire city was razed, forest was burnt. And each family, not even individual, each family received $700 from the US government. At the same time as they were sending billions to Ukraine. So to their own citizen, they could not send more than $700 per person for your entire house being burnt down. But you had billions for not Ukrainian citizen, for arms manufacturers who would actually end up killing the Ukrainian citizens. But who's celebrating? US citizen is celebrating, Ukrainian citizen is celebrating. Oh, we got so many billions. Oh, we gave so many billions. Nobody stops to think. And I'm saying this, I'm sorry to say it in this way, we are blind sheep. We have been so deeply programmed to dance when ordered to dance by the headlines on newspapers or by the images on the media of television or now your social media. You see a child with a broken limb or whatever it is because of somebody else attacking, and you shed tears and say, now you have hate, and in your hate, in your anger, in your passion, and they want you to have that, you stop thinking. You become instinctive animal in your response. And unfortunately, humanity as a collective has not trained itself sufficiently to say, why am I angry with someone I don't even know? Based on an image some unknown person has shown to me with what agenda I do not know. Or can I consciously break out of this anger and think for a moment? The billions going from the US are killing Ukrainians. Of course, they are also killing Russians. But when you look at the asymmetry of the war, Russia is far more powerful, at least more than 100 times more powerful. In numbers, in weapons, in technologies, in trainings, Ukraine is nothing compared to it. At the very start of the war, it was clear if it was an all-out war, Ukraine would have been crushed. It did not, because it did not ever become an all-out war for reasons which we will see. But even today, if Russia decides that they want to take over Ukraine, they can just overnight take over, but with a great destruction, which they don't want to do because, well, they are brothers from both sides. And they know it. Ukraine knows it, Russians know it. We do not know it because we never bothered to look at their history, and the media lied to us. So what you're seeing here is, in this state of inebriation by the images and the propaganda, what the American people do not realize is their hard-earned money, taxpayer dollars, going for what? To arms manufacturers to kill Ukrainians as much as Russians, but much more Ukrainians, about 5 times more Ukrainians than Russians. And their own people who are suffering because of a fire are getting nothing. And you should understand this and actually wake up. And if this is the case for American people, it's equally the case for the European people, where the European NATO countries are similarly celebrating or giving weapons to Ukraine. And it's equally the case for us even in India. At the end of the day, that war lasting longer, is causing globally a turmoil, not just in terms of suffering psychologically, spiritually, but equally economically, politically. But as I said, there are these other interests which say, this is useful, we need to keep it going as long as possible. And among them, I said, the third reason for the career politicians, you don't need to do any work. You don't need to build your roads because people are too busy sacrificing for Ukraine and not asking you to keep your roads clear or repair the roads or bring down your prices. Gas prices have gone up because of Ukraine war. Yes, but for Ukrainian people we will suffer. No. You are suffering so that your politicians can benefit. Ukrainian people are not benefiting, they are getting killed. The only people benefiting are the politicians and the arms manufacturers. Nobody else. Your sacrifice is wasted. You're only harming yourself. And I say this to anybody, anywhere on earth, in any country, going to war or supporting a war. It's not helping anybody. It is a falsehood. It should end. So, look at one more cause. So I've looked at arms manufacturers, career politicians, and their interests. One more is economic interests. You see, similar to what happened with Israel also. There is oil and gas interest. And eastern part of Ukraine particularly has large gas deposits. And so some of the war is over that also. It also had shared resources with erstwhile Soviet Union, Russia. It had the nuclear power plant, as you know. It's just on the Ukrainian eastern side. So each one wants control over it. Water, dams, rivers, again become cause. Who controls the rivers? Who controls the water? Because wars will be fought over rivers. Look at the fact that we have this Sindhu river from India going through Pakistan. If India uses up more water, Pakistan will starve, literally, because you will not have water to water the food growth fields. So there's an agreement, and that's a point of pressure for India over Pakistan. There's a river that comes, Brahmaputra river, from Tibet into India. Since China took over Tibet, effectively that river is now under control of the Chinese Communist Party and is actually used as a threat point over India. And despite promises going back decades, they actually put not one but multiple dams on the river. This has two effects. At any point they can block the river and divert the waters to China, which they will do, because they've already created the passages for the diversion of water. The day they decide to do, they will create an excuse and block the water, and suddenly the whole of the northeast region fed by Brahmaputra river will go dry. Or they could just open the sluice gates and create a flood. You are controlling another country's basic security. So that becomes a cause even for going to war. And there is shared river space and so on between Ukraine and eastern part of Ukraine and Russia. And typically what happens is a river becomes a dividing line between countries inevitably across a few centuries or between kingdoms. Then economic had fourth aspect, which is food. Ukraine has often been described as the bread basket of Europe. Bulk of the, I believe, wheat production and various other foods, because Ukraine has a lot of fertile soil, is growing there and from there being distributed all over Europe and other parts. And the war effectively has put a stop to the normal cycle of growth as well as food distribution. At some point, the food transport, which was done by ships from the Ukrainian ports, that came under fire because the same ports were used for arms transfers, Russia attacking, Russia blocking, and so on. The result was food prices shot up. But what is interesting is, and this is why you must understand this is not as it seems. In France, for example, although certain prices went up, there was a lack of certain goods which were coming from Ukraine earlier, there were other goods which had nothing to do with Ukraine, which also mysteriously had a shortfall or vanished from the public shelves of supermarkets. Some, for example, which were the certain products which were coming from Italy stopped coming, and prices shot up. So it created in people this fear of shortage and triggered the panic, which, as I said before, Cabal wants that, so that you're in a survival mode. And meanwhile blame it conveniently on Ukraine and raise prices, because if you're controlling the companies which produce it, you create an artificial shortage, double the price, people will happily pay double the price. And all the manufacturers of food are happy with this, because they're getting extra for no reason, because of that war, which they have nothing to do with. But because we, consumers, are sheep, we just believe it all. And because the media is lying to us and telling us it is because of Ukraine war that these products have become scarce or high in price. But all prices have gone up suddenly, even having nothing to do with Ukraine. And as a result, there is this huge inflation that's happening, not only in the US, in Europe, and most parts of the world. Now, what happened during the Ukraine war was, there was a pressure on India to export wheat, to replace Ukraine. Had India participated in this game, then there would have been a deficit in India, there would have been a shortage, and we would have had a huge inflation, lack of food, well, in the name of helping Ukraine, by the way. When it was absolutely not needed, Ukraine had enough wheat for the whole of Europe. but it was blocked because of their own stupidities. So at that point, Modi government resisted and got very strong, violent criticisms from European leaders. This was one of the reasons why European leaders were fawning over the Modi government, asking it to take sides against Russia, for Europe, etc. But Modi was very tactful in his management, was able to satisfy both sides. He bought arms from the Western manufacturers and got oil from Russia at very low rates, and created various kinds of exchange mechanisms bypassing the US dollar and so on. The result was India overall won, and we did not get any significant inflation compared to what happened in the rest of the world. And I'm giving this as an example of how a good leader thinking ahead for national interest can protect from cabal operations which should have been otherwise global famines or global shortages and global inflations. And at which point they could have said, yes, that's the nature of the economy. Today they can't say that because in India we don't have the same inflation. So you can see that this is not true, because somewhere else you can see that it's different. But had it been everywhere equally, as with COVID, they said, yes, it's everywhere, so then you have no verification, you have no way to validate. So food was one of the very significant economic elements of Ukraine. Ukraine having the most fertile land, as they say, largely in Europe. What has happened during the war is, because the farmers could not grow their crops normally or sell them normally, they all went into debt. And the result was, under a government plan, many of them of course moved out, but under the government plan, they are now given an opportunity to sell off their lands for economic reasons. Who has come in and bought them? These cabal agencies, BlackRock and other companies, which I'm sorry I don't remember all their names, there are 3 or 4 of them, buying up large tracts of land in Ukraine. Now the same farmer tomorrow will be a worker for these multinationals. The lands which were so far distributing and strengthening Ukrainian economy would now be owned by a multinational entity, and you can see the consequences. In the United States, Bill Gates has bought up something like more than a quarter of the US farmland all over the US. China has bought up large chunks of farmland. Why? It's as if in the long term, the farmlands are going to be shifted into multinational ownerships who will then control food, content, prices, etc. So this is also one of the goals of the Ukrainian war, is to force farmers to be able to sell off lands. And so this becomes now the economic compulsion. We have looked at 4 compulsions. Within the economic, we saw 4 compulsions again. Then there are linguistic, cultural, historical compulsions. I've given the links for the differences as well as similarities between Russia and Ukraine. There are identities, there are ego elements, there are affinities, and there is between any 2 strong cultures a blending that takes place. So the entire eastern portion of Ukraine is Russia speaking largely, culturally closer to Russia, less Ukrainian, and then there are the Ukrainian, it's not common man, there are ego groups which will attack them. So in this eastern part of Ukraine, a large number of Jewish people were targeted going back a few centuries. And there are people who are documenting this on Twitter. If you just do Ukraine and Nazi, you search for these keywords, you will find a lot of videos showing how, going back even through the Second World War, it was commonplace for the Nazi ideology, which was also based in Ukraine at that point, to attack the Jews. The same thing continues, and then it's a slight shift from there to the Russian-speaking people. So all of these East European regions of Ukraine, East Ukrainian regions in Ukraine, being somewhat different, you don't need to have differences which require you to kill others, but being somewhat different, you can play now one group against another using cabal toolkits, which we have discussed before, and amplify the differences, build hate until it starts becoming a problem. That being the case, it's been a while since a few decades at least since the USSR broke, where there were systematic attacks taking place for linguistic or other reasons. Groups which were funded to secede were also active. So now I look at the geopolitical perspective here. Russia naturally would want to maintain some hold on Ukraine and very likely funded some of these, maybe because of linguistic affinities or cultural affinities, promoted some of this. And so within Ukraine, there was always these two groups, the strongly pro-Russian, and then some who had nothing against Russia, but had nothing particular in terms of affinity to Europe either. And within those, Europe or the US funded the groups to be anti-Russia. So very quickly what happens is within Ukraine, two political groups form. Remember, they don't necessarily represent the popular people, but they are loud, they are noisy, they give you the impression by the means we discussed last time as if they are everywhere, but actually they could be very small in numbers. And then by selectively promoting through the media, they will create hate for each other. So if you go back maybe 30 years, there was no real big problem. But around the time, let's say 2004, when that first Maidan revolution comes up, which we discussed last time, which is completely orchestrated, the divisions have hardened. And then there is this one person who is the main representative for the Ukrainian values that want to remain largely aligned with Russia. Because, well, there are such deep connections going back for so long. So I have unfortunately a little issue with the names of some of them, but let me see if I can see the name here. It's in the links which I have shared, and for those of you who will want to go in detail, you'll find the links. So there is this one, there are a couple of people actually, Yushchenko being one of the, Yushchenko is one of those who's pro-Russian, if I recall right. And in the 2004, there is an attempt first to overthrow him. There's another major regional leader who stands for Ukraine's, see, they're not saying go to secede with Russia. They're saying we stay aligned with Russia because of historical, past, cultural and other reasons, and not align with NATO against Russia. So we'll understand that shortly. So these are groups which are not really saying you have to be joined with Russia. You say we are Ukrainian, but we should remain allies because of long connections. Yushchenko is overthrown not once but twice. So in the 2014 election, he's the one who gets elected in a very popular election, and on the basis that Ukraine should remain friends with Russia. And at that point, there is the overthrow, some of which I have mentioned last time, but there was this group that comes up and says we should join with NATO and Europe and against Russia. And a group now walks towards the police wearing helmets and bulletproof vests and all dressed in the same clothes. And at some point, a shot rings out aimed at the police, ostensibly from this group. Police fires back and there's exchange of fire. People die. Whether actually people died or not, that's one of the things in question, but the media hits the story, people died. That is used instantly to inflame passions across various cities, demonstrations which become headlines, and eventually this person is overthrown by somebody else. Doesn't matter. He then sets the base for Zelensky's return, which I mentioned last time how that actually happened for Zelensky's election. When Zelensky comes to power, the current president of Ukraine, he actually comes to power saying, we want peace with Russia because we are one people. Why should we fight? And he promises the people that he will bring peace in the Donbas regions, the eastern part of Ukraine, and says that we will stop all this conflict and war and bring peace with Russia as well as with those regions. On that basis, he gets elected. But then what does he do after getting elected? He starts aligning with NATO and even announces that Ukraine is going to join NATO. That triggers Russia. So for this we have to step back a few decades. When the USSR broke up, it's very important we understand how this happens. When the USSR broke up, one of the fears was that in counter to USSR, the NATO, North American Treaty Organization, was a military bulwark to prevent spread of USSR. And that was the point where the two were in a deadlock. USSR breaks up. They said if we do that, NATO will just take over. So there were a series of agreements in which Gorbachev was given the assurance that they would not, NATO had become irrelevant and they would not move an inch. I think it was one US, I've given the link for this also, the US leader who makes that announcement, and the promise is made, treaties are signed that there would be no further attempt for NATO to expand eastward, and not an inch, as they said. But then what happened was, remember what we discussed last time, they began this millions of dollars of funding to start swinging public opinion, not just in Ukraine, but in all the East European countries. And we named them last time. We saw how in many of them, these color revolutions were actually orchestrated. It doesn't take much money. As you can see, these are relatively small countries and quite used to obedience and subservience under the USSR framework. So easy to manipulate. What happens then is, over that point, there's an agreement, I think it was the Minsk agreement, which was made, that Ukraine would always remain neutral. Nobody is asking Ukraine to join Russia. They remain neutral, not join NATO, is all that was required, which was fine. And as long as these pro-Russian leaders were there, there was no problem. From 2004, with the first Maidan revolution, where they were toppled and this other person comes to power, he for the first time starts declaring that Ukraine has to align with NATO and against Russia, which creates further problems. Again, 2014 in an election, this pro-Russian person comes to power on the basis that we will make peace with all sides, we remain independent. He gets overthrown. And the next person who comes again swings towards NATO. And Zelensky similarly came to power on the promise that he wanted peace, that Russian people and Ukrainians are the same people, is actually his exact phrase. But once in power, he swings the other way. And under his regime, the East Ukrainian portion began to have a series of military assaults, let's say. Now, it's difficult to say whether they were provoked from the semi-Russian people in East Ukraine, or they were actually coming from a hardline hatred. But looking at the past history of regular assaults on these East Ukrainian people, one is led to believe, and one has enough evidence also in the media as well as videos from those people of being unfairly targeted. In particular, there is this one regiment called Azov Regiment. And we have to understand where this came from. Azov Regiment was initially a kind of an independent militia. Now, why a government allows an independent militia to form with weapons, by the way, and training, is a mystery. And you can only understand that if you understand behind it is the long-term plan of revolution and toppling governments. So, under the 2004 person who has now taken over after the Maidan overthrow, suddenly the Azov regiment starts getting prominence, funding, support, and then is integrated into the Ukrainian military as a regiment. These people were hardcore Nazis. At the end of the Second World War, the headquarters of Nazism and its theology, I'm going to use this word because of the occult practices involved, was largely based still within Ukraine. And that never shut down. In the Nuremberg trials, which were largely focused on Germany and nearby regions, Austria partly, but this part in Ukraine was left untouched. And so this group festered. They continued some of their practices, their beliefs, and they would tattoo themselves with what in India we call swastika, but in Germany is called Hakenkreuz, I think, and the black sun. Schwarz-Sonnen, I think. So the black sun symbol, which was the Nazi ideology, as well as the lightning, as well as the tilted swastika, etc. All these symbols were part of this Azov group, which then was incorporated and merged into the Ukrainian military as its own wing. Now there's actually data in NATO, in US, in Canada, where when they're sending funds to the Ukrainian military, they're specifying, do not transfer to Azov regiment, that is an extremist and barbaric, etc. Group. But this is the group that is provoking in large parts the killings of the East Ukrainian people. So when after the 2014 revolution, this leader now swings to NATO and says we will rejoin NATO, Russia says no, that's a red line. Because the agreement for dismantling the USSR was Ukraine would remain independent. And they demanded that you declare yourself independent and do not join NATO. Because then what happens is NATO comes on the border of Russia. And Ukraine is effectively a buffer country, as well as the other East European countries. So there's a yes no play going on, political double talk. But what happened within that, and this was during Obama's rule in the US, the US military began to enter the Ukrainian military and established bases all across the Russian front of Ukraine. They are not yet part of NATO, but by a tie-up with the US military, these bases are being established. Now, if you look at the chart of the bases, and missile bases, by the way, they're all kept on the edge, on the border of Russia. And not just in Ukraine, but in many other East European countries, they had started that process. Some resisted, sometimes they were toppled, some just accepted. Maybe after they were toppled, I do not know. But the result was suddenly Russia finds itself in a ring of missiles so close that from launch to strike in Moscow would be a few minutes. Remember what happened with the US when the Soviet Union tried to establish a missile base in Cuba. The US government put a foot down and practically went to war, even a nuclear war, to protect that. Because from Cuba, if a missile launch takes place, there's not enough time to protect yourself. So that becomes a red line. Something equivalent was taking place. But not just that, something else was happening which is also very disturbing when you look at the data, is that the US military was actually creating biolabs. Now, we spoke about this briefly a few sessions ago, how there was a Chinese biolab in the US which had samples of Ebola, among other things. These are deadly pathogens to which there are existing no cures. And they're supposed to be, bulk of them at least, the most deadly ones are only supposed to be happening in some central part of Africa. Why would you bring those pathogens into mainland and start running a biolab with tweaking of the genes to what is called gain of control function, meaning raising the potency of their virulence against human beings, unless your goal is to use it against human beings? As it turns out, Ukraine had not 1, not 2, not 5, not 10, not 15, not 20 biolabs. But on the US website, they spoke of 31 biolabs. Subsequently, they spoke of 41 biolabs. Now, I'm not concerned with it's 41 or 40 or 31. It's a number which is so crazy. For a tiny country like Ukraine, you have one biolab, let's say, for whatever purposes, even if it is for good. But you do not need to bring Ebola. You do not need 2 biolabs, you do not need 3 biolabs. It's a tiny country. And here you have more than 30 biolabs. And again, if you look at the chart of where the biolabs are located, they are all on the border of Russia. So if it was for the good of Ukraine, it would be scattered equally all around. Still, you would not explain why there's 30. You needed only 1 or 2 at most. But you have more than 30, and they're all on the border of Russia, then you start wondering, what is this? And I've seen all these papers, these were all on the US. I've seen it myself, because when the war started, there were groups that I was watching and who were putting up these links. You had only to go to the United States Embassy official website in Ukraine, and they had a whole page on their biolabs they were running. And what were they doing, among other things with Ebola? They were testing how migrating birds, carry illnesses. Now, a biolab sitting in Ukraine is testing migrating birds. Ukraine is too small for migrating birds to be of consequence. It's only a country like India which needs to consider how a bird migrating from the north to the south might spread a disease. Ukraine is too small for even spreading. You don't need a bird to spread a disease for migration. A bird living is enough to fly all over the place. You have to be testing migrating birds and diseases spread by migrating birds only if your plan is to target outside Ukraine. Now, all of this is just common sense, raw data. You draw your own conclusions, I won't say more. But this was one of the trigger points. So when Russia stepped into Ukraine, it declared these. First, it said if Ukraine announces that they will not join NATO, there's no war. But still, we have three goals, which is limited to the eastern part of Ukraine. And that is first, protect the Russian-speaking people, which is being attacked by the Azov regiment, who are Nazis, hardcore Nazis. And second, demilitarize the hardcore Nazis, basically take away their weapons, because Ukraine was now treating them as part of their army and giving them weapons. And the third, shut down the biolabs. Now, when Russia announced this, and it was a very clearly stated goal, that's why they call it a limited military intervention. I don't know exact terms, but it was not an invasion of Ukraine. They were not interested in Ukraine. Ukraine was, as I said earlier, literally friends, brothers in arms. So they declared this goal, and that's when we found in Europe an announcement shutting all access to Russian so-called propaganda. Because had the European people known that this was the goal and Russia was limiting itself to this, or that Russia would stop the war if Ukraine announced it's not joining NATO, nobody would have supported the existing madness of continuing to send weapons, funds, arms, and people, personnel, to die on the battlefield and to die or kill more Ukrainians. Zelensky himself, as I said, 2 months down, announced that we want to have peace, we want to stop the war, which is when not the US, the UK Prime Minister comes to him and pressures him to withdraw this. And I don't know what mechanism they would have used to pressure him further, but being a cabal puppet, it's easy. The war continued. And many other occasions where Russia announced this openly, that we have completed our objectives, we are ready to stop the war, all you need to do is you will say that you will not join NATO and we will stop the war. So over these 2 years, this has been repeated so many times. But you only know this if you watched Putin's statements or the Russian media. Because Russian media and Putin's statements were completely blockaded from the Western media. Even in India, largely it's coming from the Western media. If you look at the articles that come to you, you will see it comes from Western sources. And they're just repeating the data. And occasionally we would hear from India, at least, Putin's statements. And if you're on Twitter, then you had people, after Elon Musk took over, you had people actually sharing those statements. So I'm putting all this in context of the cultural, linguistic, historical identities and conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, the identities were much stronger, conflicts were much weaker until they were sufficiently fanned to justify whatever form it took. And even there, it was a very strategic move. After the first few weeks of the invasion of eastern Ukraine, Russia, or actually those regions now liberated from Azov regiment, announced their own independence. So as a move, it was brilliant under international law. And Trump actually made this comment that it was a brilliant move by Putin. But he also said, had I been president, I would not even have allowed this much to happen. But he said it was a brilliant move because actually they fit all the international requirements, a people independently declaring their independence and becoming effectively a buffer state between Russia and even Ukraine in case Ukraine joins NATO. So this was the limited objective. Had Russia wanted to take over Ukraine, look what it would have done. What did the US do when it entered Iraq or any other country? A few targeted missiles go straight at the capital, destroy the headquarters of politics, military, water supply, electricity, communications. The country goes blind, deaf, dumb. Even your troops don't need to go in. You have a few agents who are sitting there, they are activated and whatever is required is done. There would have been no bloodshed. There would have been destruction, of course, but destruction of resources. You'd have to rebuild the country in some way at some point. But Russia chose to limit its operations to the eastern part, which is why, during these 2 years, you had American politicians, including American president, flying into Kiev. You had rock stars going to Kiev and having dances and music programs in the open and otherwise, to raise awareness for Ukraine, for war in support of Ukraine. How do you explain that? A country at war is having nightclubs and dancing with American rock stars coming in. How would you explain that unless you realize that the bulk of the fighting is on the east and nowhere else? The bulk of it. Yes, there were a few strategic missiles right at the beginning aimed at military centers. Yes, there were also centers from where Ukraine fired missiles, and naturally there is the missile fired in return, which happened to be near schools or other such vulnerable civilian spaces, as you see with the Hamas doing the same strategy. And yes, there was collateral damage. But these were not central to the war. The center of the war has always been on the ground on the eastern side, by a very deliberate choice from Russia. Had Russia wanted, they could have taken over Kiev within days. There's actually a statement Putin made in 2014, in which he said, if we wanted to, within 2 weeks we could have taken over the whole of Ukraine. But we're choosing not to. All we ask is that Ukraine declares itself neutral and not join NATO. This is in 2014. And this is a fact. If you look at the militaries and the equipment and capabilities. So this, I'm looking at the cultural, linguistic, historical elements and the compulsions which led to this part of the war. There's one more reason for the war, for which Ukraine was targeted. So I'm going to end with this part for today. That is human trafficking. Just as at one point, Saudi Arabia was a hub for human trafficking. And in 2000, was it 18 or 19? 18, I think. When Mohammed bin Salman took over, he ended it. So it was one of the largest trafficking hubs in the world. The European center of human trafficking has been Ukraine. Now, you only have to look at your literature, your spam, your movies, spam box. Every now and then you will get these emails saying Ukrainian women available as friends online. They don't give other countries' names. Why? Because Ukraine had been built up as a hub. And there was this huge trafficking for women and children, for organs, and there's another side which is a very dark side, which we have mentioned before from the Cabal perspective, where they needed human beings for other reasons, for their satanic practices, including human sacrifice. And in a war, when you have a mass exodus of refugees, everything is available for cheap, and there's nobody to validate where they went. When the war ends, they'll just say, oh, so many people died, and anybody missing is considered to be dead because of war. You do not realize how many millions were trafficked because they were war refugees, and there's no paper, no documentation to track them, and they vanish. Large numbers of Ukrainians were displaced and settled in countries across Europe. Why would you do that? Unless you're thinking the war is going to be permanent. You would create a refugee camp, track them carefully in one of the neighboring countries, and send them back when the war finishes. Why do you settle them in another country and far away, including in England and then in the Ireland? Why would you shift Ukrainian people to Ireland where the temperature, climate, language are so different? Unless the goal was actually to get people out and create a big mixture, if that's part of the Kalergi plan I've spoken of before, or as part of a human trafficking operation. Where because you're moving a bulk of people in a state of panic, nobody's tracking how many come or where they go, and they vanish and nobody knows what happens. So unfortunately, this is one of the compulsions of war, for which you will find everywhere on earth. Whenever a war ends, very soon, within a short time, somewhere else some war is started, and you have this huge trafficking that takes place where people are taken away from there and settled elsewhere in the world. So even in Africa there's a war, and you'll find large number of Somalians brought into the USA. I believe under Obama it was 60,000 Somalians were transferred to the USA. Why? If you want to help them, well, create a refugee camp, educate them, or kickstart their lives there in their own homes. Why do you bring them to the USA? Interestingly, they formed groups in certain areas which became the basis for electing from that side for the first time Muslim woman into US Congress. And it was because of the majority balance of the refugees which had been brought in. So effectively what happened under Obama, a group of Muslims transferred, resettled in a concentration, which is a very large concentration, who now have the power to elect a person into Congress, and it becomes a Muslim woman who gets elected for the first time. On her Muslim identity, not because of her love for the US country. Being elected as a Muslim woman, she is abusing the United States. She is criticizing the US. She is showing disrespect for the US Constitution and US flag. Just look up all her statements. I won't name her, it's obvious for you, those of you who know. So why is she in Congress? And why this, unless you say it was an intentional structure to be able to elect people for a particular cause. So I'm not going to go deeper into this. Just understand these are all various compulsions, and all this shows you the compulsions. Again, I'll summarize: the cabal, which just wants war everywhere; arms manufacturers for their sales, for testing new technologies, kickbacks to politicians; career politicians for their image, for their kickbacks, to stay in power, avoiding work; economic reasons, which could be oil and gas in this case, nuclear power also in this case, water also, and food in this case; cultural, linguistic, historical reasons, which were identities and identity politics, which can be inflamed or neutralized if there's goodwill, but in this case inflamed; and finally human trafficking for reasons which we have seen, sexual trafficking, organ trafficking, and cabal trafficking, and so on. So all these compulsions being in place, when in fact Ukraine announced that it is going to join NATO, and Putin had already declared that in 2014 as a red line. So many years down, finally Ukraine starts making the moves for this, and at the same time activating the Azov regiment, integrating into its military, and allowing it to pursue the killings on the eastern Russian portions. It becomes the trigger point for Russia to step in a limited intervention as they promised, which stayed limited, as I said. Had they wanted, they could have just gone across the whole of Ukraine. They effectively demilitarized the Azov regiment. They shut down the biolabs. And incidentally, this is one of the Congress women. Initially, the US denied there were biolabs. And then in Congress, this head of the, I think she was the ambassador to Ukraine, or one of the persons involved with the Ukraine program. She said, yes, we had biolabs, and we had to do everything possible to destroy all our evidence when the Russians came in. Now again, you have to understand, if you were doing legitimate work, what is there to destroy? You would simply say, all right, this is a secure biolab, please do not destroy anything. You can come in and check, we're doing nothing against you. What is the evidence to destroy unless you're doing experiments which to the Russians would be harmful? And incidentally, Russia did take all the evidence from some of the biolabs, there were so many, and put it in the United Nations. Mainstream media was completely silent on this. Mainstream media never told us that Russia had shown evidence of biolabs and the programs, and in what way they were harmful to Russia. At the UN, mainstream media is silent, and therefore very ignorant of this fact. So, demilitarize Azov regiment, clean up biolabs, protect the East Ukrainian Russian-speaking people, making them declare their independence, which is, as a strategic move, brilliant. And all this was completed within a few months. The war has continued because of other reasons, and particularly this business of the tactical weapons use. I've touched upon some of these. The Kinzhal missile, for example, is one of the most advanced technologies, hypersonic missiles, which is a game changer for the future of warfare in the whole world. India immediately activated a hypersonic missile program because they saw the effectivity of it. There is no known way today to defend yourself against a hypersonic missile unless you use energy beam weapons, which so far at least we have not seen officially its use in Ukraine, but we don't know. So I'm just showing you there are all these other compulsions which have unnecessarily extended the Ukrainian war. As long as the funding and the weapons continue, this will continue. At this point, in the US politics, the situation has shifted. The main speaker of the House is no more under cabal control. As a result, he has announced the delinking of Ukrainian funds from Israeli funds. So they continue to support Israel, but not Ukraine. And what he says is, yes, you can fund Ukraine, but you must now monitor where the funds are going and in what way they are used, instead of just dumping money with no accountability. So by demanding accountability, suddenly the funding has stopped. Very interesting. And at the same time, there is the wariness within Ukraine itself. So many people have died, or so many have moved out of Ukraine, huge population move, that you have old people above 50 now being conscripted, and young people below 21 being conscripted to go to the front with what training? Nothing, just to die. And there's a point where the population has now turned against Zelensky, and they are all for the military commander, the general who heads the army, who is now more popular than Zelensky because he wants peace. And remember, military generals in Ukraine are friends with the Russian generals. They know their commonalities as well as their differences. They don't want the war. But this was the compulsion of the circumstances. So if this does happen, Zelensky is afraid of being toppled, and he's actually complaining that there might be a Maidan revolution in Ukraine to topple him, with this man coming to power. And on this basis, he also cancelled the elections. Well, one can justify the cancellation on various grounds. I'm not interested in the specifics. And I'm not, as you can see, taking sides with any of them. I'm showing the compulsions and the basis on which the war could end overnight. And all it needs is for the Ukrainian politicians to say, we don't want war, we will stay neutral. And overnight the war will end. But because there are other interests which seize upon the politicians' play, and then there are, as you know, the powers behind the cabal which want wars to be, these things have continued. There is even this statement which was made by the German premier, I think it was, or the foreign minister, I don't remember now, let's say German premier. She actually made this statement because the agreement that Russia had with NATO saying there would be no movement eastward for NATO expansion is one of the Minsk agreements. She said, Minsk agreement was just a way for us to buy time. Meaning, all along the goal was for NATO to extend eastwards and take over the East European countries and come in a head-on collision with Russia. And we have bought time over these 20 years, and now we need to get on with the big conflict with Russia. And this is the reason why George Soros describes Ukraine as a flashpoint for a third world war. A world war means other countries would join. Now, why would other countries join? Ukraine has nothing for them. It means nothing for Europe. And if you see the evidence of military intervention, Russia stopped. It did not even bother to go up to Kiev, except as a feint to divert resources, to prevent Ukraine from sending its tanks to the eastern part. They blocked the roads, which was treated as a Russian threat on Kiev, but it was nowhere a threat. They used their oldest tanks, the most useless, which could be blown up to prevent the troops moving, and that was all. So why would it become a third world war? Unless behind this was an agenda which wanted to increase it to a larger conflagration. And the statement of George Soros to this effect is part of what I would call predictive programming, to prepare people for an intensification and expansion of the war. You see already what was happening. Poland, Germany, UK and others were sending their troops as well as weapons to Ukraine. And there's a point where Russia has to say enough of this, and they would bomb a supply line to Ukraine, which should be treated by Poland or UK or Germany as an act of war against NATO. Immediately it would activate a NATO retaliation and start the Third World War. It was as simple as this. So they did everything possible. If you look at the evidence in the news of the last 2 years, they did everything possible to provoke Russia, including even one case, so-called missile that landed, I think it was in Georgia or Poland, one of the neighboring countries from Ukraine, and they said it was a Russian missile. As it turned out, it was a Ukrainian missile. But why? To trigger the war. And on Russia's side, it has been a case of extreme restraint, Knowing that the weapons are coming, they do not bomb the supply line until it enters Ukraine, and then they bombed it wherever they could. And so it is extreme restraint to ensure it does not end up in a third world war. And we have to appreciate this. Internally within Russia, there was an attempt at a revolution against Putin, not on one occasion but on two occasions, including a point where the group that they were using to fight as mercenaries turned against Russia, and the group actually started going towards Moscow on the road, and at some point they stopped and reversed. And then the head of this group, Wagner group, he died in a plane crash a few weeks after. So all this is part of Russia's internal defense mechanisms to protect itself from a regime overthrow, which was also part of the planning. So if you understand how these things work, you can see all this evidence happening during the last 2 years. It's been fascinating to see this, but the most important thing I would say is the restraint shown by Russia to limit the war to the eastern part of Ukraine primarily, touching the other parts with missiles at long distance only to destroy military assets where necessary. And the first time they used the Kinzhal missile, the hypersonic missile, which goes like anything from 5 to 10 times the speed of sound, it was to blow up a military center in which a large number of US advisors were training Ukrainians at a top level, and it was a command and control center with a lot of weaponry, and they blew up the whole thing in one go. So US lost a lot of its elite military people, including commandos which were based there. NATO had its base there, they all lost it in one go. And that shocked NATO and already changed the course of the war. But anyway, I want to highlight this, that Russia chose to ensure the war did not expand into a third world war. And for this, we have to be very appreciative of the restraint shown. As a result of this, some 50,000 Russian soldiers died. They need not have died. Russia could have just bombed with missiles, overwhelmed Ukraine. It chose not to. It had all the means before the war became big, before the funds and missiles from the US and NATO came into Ukraine. Ukraine was a sitting duck. It could have been finished overnight, literally. They didn't do it. The first restraint was not appreciated. Instead, US and NATO rushed in and extended the war. Still, Russia could have overwhelmed it. It did not. It chose to not destroy the bulk of Ukraine, but in the process lost very heavily militarily, with various setbacks each time. And we have to appreciate what this means, and that in spite of cabal interests to provoke a third world war, I've spoken of Putin as a disruptor. A choice was made while losing a large number of Russian lives to not allow it to become a third world war where there would be far greater destruction, not just of Russian but human lives across Europe. And this has been saved. Hopefully, things will change soon enough. That is to be seen. So we're still, I believe we are at the tail end of the war. You can see how the media has already moved away from Ukraine. And so no one is waving Ukrainian flags, now they're waving Palestinian flags. But with this, an end of funding, maybe many things will change. Some kind of agreement will be signed. We'll see what form it takes. But we have been saved because of the restraint and a huge number of loss of lives, which was absolutely unnecessary, which was entirely avoidable on both sides, unfortunately. And so, very clearly we have to declare, no one is right in any war. But in this case, you have to understand the circumstances which triggered the war, the compulsions and interests which want the war and have wanted it to continue and extend, and how easy, how simple it would be to stop the war overnight. If only we, humanity, people, wake up and say enough, no more. And my purpose in speaking of this in this way, in this going in depth in this, is to bring us to this awareness. Finally, the leaders can only do what we allow them to do. If we become conscious, they cannot play us. If we refuse to be triggered emotionally and otherwise, They cannot influence us. If we demand a sane solution without destruction, without killing, they cannot justify killing. Or even if they start, it will not have the support of the people, it will collapse, it will end. And it starts with us, each one of us. And if nothing else, within us, in our circumstances, we should speak, we should make people conscious, help in the larger awakening and awareness, for which you must understand the big picture. That was the intention of this series on current affairs. So, having completed this part, the next time I will only take up questions which have been pending, and quite a few, because I think I've largely covered the main issues I wanted to touch. I've put a lot of links. Do look at them. Particularly, there is this link which has RFK Kennedy commenting on the US biolabs in Ukraine and speaking of what was really happening behind those in the biolabs and what was behind it as an intention, and the other things we have taken up in detail. I would request you to leave your questions in the chat box so that I will collect them and prepare them for our discussion next time. I think that's all for today. Leena, Narad, if you want to say anything, please feel free.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all of you who have been watching this, because the feedback we have received has been really good. So many of you have been appreciating the series, and I found it helpful to understand the world affairs. And for me, it's made it worthwhile. Otherwise, one is hesitant to speak openly of some of these things when you're not sure if everybody would understand or not. And I would suggest for you also now to recognize that if people around you do not know the bigger picture, do not hesitate, speak up. Sometimes you will receive pushback. Show them evidence or ask them to research. At the end of the day, the only thing we can do is validate for ourselves. Don't go by somebody's statement, not even statements I have made. Although I have done my background homework and documentation, I cannot share everything. It would have to be a pretty complex exercise for which I don't have much time. But you just have to look up these things, verify, validate. If I'm off on a few numbers here and there, please understand that that's the human memory. But broadly on the framework that I've described, you get a picture that makes sense and also shows you the way out. And if all of us can unite in this aspiration that as we grow, as we awaken, and humanity wakes up enough, these wars will become unnecessary and even impossible to be triggered. The Mother had assured us that ever since the supramental consciousness has come on earth, and this year being one of the anniversaries of the supramental manifestation, she said there will no more be a third world war. But she said there will be these local conflicts, and Ukraine being an example of that. And although Cabal attempted to push it to a third world war, it did not happen, and that is one of the results of the supramental action. But you must understand, it's not something you have to go to sleep with saying, supramental is doing. Supramental acts through our awakening. Its pressure on us has helped humanity wake up enough to say, no, this should not happen. But the pressure is indirect and through much suffering, because we do not open directly to its influence, to the divine influence. And the more we are able to consciously open, we individually, and as a result, a larger part of the influence in humanity, the more directly that action will be through less suffering, through less struggle, and very quickly, perhaps even the need for regional wars will be completely extinguished. And it's towards this that we will look forward to and work for. Namaste.
Namaste.